You're listening to Jay's Analysis. This is the introduction to the Jay's Analysis podcast. The only authoritative source for Jay's Analysis is Jay's Analysis. Film, philosophy, geopolitics, the esoteric, and much, much more. Satire and comedy too, now added bonus for free. Welcome, you're listening to Jay's Analysis. I wanted to deal with a topic that we've not really covered in depth at Jay's Analysis, and that is the subject of public education. We've mentioned it. We've talked about the Frankfurt School. We've talked about these specified subjects in passing, but we haven't focused a specific episode on social engineering, public schooling, and why school sucks. And so I got Brett, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce your last name. Brett Veinotte.
Fuck, you nailed it. You're the first person to ever get it.
What is it?
It's
I know that was really dumb, but
I love that. I love that. It's Veinotte.
Veinotte. Okay. Now, yes, I know that it sounds that way, but it's written. Actually, it's written that way. so actually, I should have pronounced it correctly, but I figured I'd fuck it up. But so Brett is the host, of course, of the popular podcast School Sucks. And I was telling Brett a couple weeks ago that I think about 5 years ago, I was eating dog food out of soup cans, poor, and I was doing grad work, and I was fed up, and I listened to some of his podcasts around that time. You were probably getting started back then. Was that?
Yeah.
And then so it had a profound effect on me because I was like, yeah, this public schooling is way off here, because I've spent all my life in this system, and I've gotten here to the point of grad school, and I ended up butting heads with this dude who was like a big time UN socialist dude who's the head of the department, and if you don't go past his firewall, he's like Gandalf on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, and you shall not pass. You know what I mean?
Right.
You have to go through the rigmarole of passing the initiatory mysteries of globalism before they'll let you into the PhD level, which is what I was going for. And so I got really disillusioned, and I almost came to blows with this dude and quit. And so your podcast, I think, helped point me in the right direction at, looking at what the heck is wrong with our school system, and maybe it just needs to be junked. But I'll let you go. What started you on School Sucks?
Well, originally I started the show in 2009, and I was a teacher myself, and I was just looking for an outlet. I used to have to sit in these meetings. I taught for a number of years in a boarding school, and then in a private day school. And then I worked on the periphery of the public system for a number of years as a college consultant, so kind of getting into a whole other problem there, and standardized test tutor. And the way I've described it before is like one job after another, one role after another, just from making observations and I guess, being blessed with a fair amount of curiosity about what I'm doing and why. I would learn my way out of the job. I would learn my way out of enjoying doing whatever job I had. So ultimately, I was working as a support for the school without knowing it. I had realized the problems with the public system. So I said, well, I'll work privately, and that's a solution. So I worked for one tutoring business and consulting business, and then I started my own in New Hampshire. But I still just felt like I was participating in the problem. I'm just telling kids they need to go to college as if it's the 13th grade.
Right.
And I'm just pushing them that way. So I started to lose satisfaction with that work as well. So I started the show just as kind of a journal, a kind of therapy almost, to be able to vent. And I really, at the time, in retrospect, I wish I would have had another 10 years to put my thoughts together about a lot of these things, because I thought, just from the experience that I had had over the course of a decade, I thought I had everything pretty figured out. And the show has evolved into just a continual learning experience for me. So, my presentation is I'm kind of an everyman. I'm an average guy. And, I'm on this journey trying to figure out school and, all the things that surround it and what real education actually is. And, people can listen and come along with me on that journey and engage in their own journey.
That sounds good. If only it were true. Now, what were you really up to? Weren't you working for the CIA?
Yes.
No, you're KGB.
Oh, I wish. Wouldn't that be cool?
I'm being stupid. Do you get accusations? Have you been called a shill and all that yet?
Yeah. There was somebody, I found my name on a blog. This was probably 6 years ago, and it was me and a bunch of other people in a circle I was running in the time. And there was some lizard talk thrown around. And I don't remember, was it, I think, it wasn't, they didn't say lizard. I'm kind of conflating. They said shapeshifters. Oh, so I don't know if shapeshifters assumes lizard.
Right, because you could just be a hologram. You could be like a holographic entity but not be a lizard, like
sure.
Max Headroom. You could be like Max Headroom.
So I was definitely accused of being a shifter, though. Right.
Well, I'm being stupid, but so the reason I asked that is that you've done well with your podcast, and anytime things get successful, you kind of get these weird things happening. But so what happened when? So you got fed up. Did you already think as you were transitioning out of the establishment and tutoring and into what you do now? Did you already have a clue of the public school system itself kind of being an indoctrination, brainwashing, MK Ultra style entity, or did you learn this later?
No, I was kind of learning it as I went, and I got a lot of excitement when I was in college, and I had some exposure to the new left ideas of history, revisionism, Howard Zinn, Chomsky. Yeah, exactly. And I got real high on this, I know something you don't know, everybody. That kind of like, oh, I've been lied to all my life, but now I know the truth. And I found myself going just from one area of exploration to another. So like the next stop after, turning into like a radical leftist Howard Zinn disciple was the conspiracy world, was like 9/11 Truth and Coast to Coast Radio. And now I really know something you don't know, I said to everybody. And, that was a sufficient stopover, maybe for a couple of years. I found Richard Grove's work, a mutual friend of ours, and his 9/11 Synchronicity, a podcast. And I was really impressed with the way that he could put content together. And, I started to think maybe this is something that I might like to do someday for myself. But I didn't know how to organize my thoughts, and I was very schooled. So I was just taking in all of this information, and I wasn't really making use of it. From there I wound up in libertarianism. And that was even more, moral superiority initially. I know lots of things you don't know now about politics. So that same kind of whatever that need is kept getting satisfied in one way or another. But along the way, I accidentally, when I was in grad school, I was working on a master's degree in educational leadership, which is to become like a public school principal ultimately. And I'm glad that didn't work out. I just was doing research for a project, and I stumbled across some articles about books by John Taylor Gatto. And I said, this was pre 9/11 truther phase for me. So I said, oh my God, there's a conspiracy about school. That's ridiculous. But in the back of my mind, like a seed was planted at that point. Like, yeah, of course you would use school if you wanted to control people. What better way? And that just kind of sat there for a number of years until I revisited. I don't remember exactly how it happened off the top of my head, but revisiting Gatto's work many years later, and then really digging into his work when I ultimately started the podcast.
a good quote along those lines. This is Horace Mann, of course, one of the founding fathers of American education. He said, "The common school is the greatest discovery ever made by man. Let the common school be expanded to its capabilities. Let it be worked with the efficiency with which it is susceptible. 9/10 of the crimes in the penal code would therefore become obsolete. The long catalog of human ills would be abridged, and man would walk more safely by the day. I believe that the common school will be the new instrument for the advancement of the human race. I believe that without free public schooling, we would be shorn of its healing power." It is like a religion, Christianity itself. And the public schools, he says, it basically goes on to say that this is man, saying that they're like a religion, they're like a cult, and that they're going to save man. And I've got a whole bevy of quotes of this nature. Do you agree? Do you think that there was this socialist conspiracy, and I believe it was, personally, amongst these characters who, of course, had monopoly capitalist backing behind them, to create little socializing outposts?
I believe it was very socialist at phase 2, which was like the first reformation of the public school system, which took place at the beginning of the 20th century through John Dewey. I think Mann was a committed, passionate, true believer, and would be very offended by the word conspiracy being ascribed to anything that he was doing. You know, I'm pretty sure that he, as Dewey and, you know, the pragmatists and the progressives later would think, they thought they were saving the world. And I think if you just look at Mann in the context of his time, you're in this period in American history where you're running out of slaves, or the institution of slavery is coming to an end, and you know you have all of these immigrants coming into the country. This is as the school system grows. Mann is working a little bit before that period, like in the 1840s and 1850s. But I think a lot of people could feel the sands shifting under their feet, and I think there was a lot of fear about the future of American society, and you know, the dilution of culture. And they thought the school had the potential, at least, to be a homogenizing force. You know,
right? Well, the reason I say that, and the reason that I do explicitly use the word conspiracy, is not because I believe that Horace Mann or John Dewey themselves were at the top of some pyramid, but rather that they were part of, or at least in Mann's case, he was a Unitarian Universalist, and that did influence his worldview, his philosophy, and he was, as I understand at least, a Freemason. And we know that Freemasonry was one of the key movers and shaker organizations behind the public school system. And so in my view, Freemasonry plays a role in basically being a whispering, spying entity. And it also serves a function, it has for many centuries, of promoting revolutions in foreign countries. And generally speaking, these are funded by foreign powers, foreign banks, British imperial power, whatever. But you see, I don't think that it's accidental that so many of these people were part of the lodge, and that's what informed their philosophy. So even if they weren't fully cognizant of the totality of the conspiracy, they were at least part of these sort of revolutionary organizations that do have the explicit goal of, re-engineering and reorganizing society. And I think that what we learned by later inquiries, like the Reese Committee and things like this, is that these big foundations have for a long time, been interested in reorganizing society, mainly through education.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have to admit that my knowledge is in that area, the Freemasonic influence on the public school system in the United States is undeveloped. It's something that I'll look into. I can zoom out a little bit and just agree with you in more general terms that there is really no simple story that I've ever found about the history of the development of public school. It's kind of all things to all people who want to control other people, and lots of different interest groups from the progressives to the industrialists to Mann's crowd, they all vied for control at one point, and this continues right up to today with things like Goals 2000 and its follow-up No Child Left Behind, and its follow-up or rebranding as Common Core, and it goes all the way back to the beginning. So yeah, there were groups of people who always understood what school was in potentia, and worked very hard to shape it, to use it to shape the society that they wanted to bring about, for sure.
What's interesting is that they all seem to promote democracy, and I'm speaking of all of the early promoters of our public school system today in the period of the characters like G. Stanley Hall, John Dewey, Boyd Bode. And then you have this wealthy Elizabeth Peabody, who's interesting because she's kind of the godmother of kindergarten. Now we know, of course, that goes back to the Prussian socialist model of education, and that was imported here to the U.S. But what Peabody, and this is like if you go to Memphis, if I recall, this is the same Peabody's. They have this giant, wealthy Peabody Hotel where the ducks ride elevators. I'm not joking. You can go.
Oh, that's very cool. Excellent.
Yeah. But Mrs. Peabody said, quote, "Children understood leading in the promised millennium of peace on earth and goodwill among men will make mankind forget the babble of confusion, and they will enter into the mutual understanding of the Pentecost miracle through kindergarten." So what I noted in my article that I wrote, I guess about a year ago, was just that what fascinated me was so many of these people have messianic approaches to education, and they also tend to tout liberal democracy.
Absolutely.
So what I think's going on here is that, and I'm not saying that Elizabeth Peabody, even as a wealthy person, was like in on a super duper conspiracy, but I think if you look at somebody like Madame Blavatsky and her interest in Freemasonry, and she, and then you can also actually find Scottish Rite magazines from about 100 years ago that will talk about the new age being brought about through public schools, is that you do have, and this is, by the way, why the UN has been such a big promoter of this stuff. It's always tied to democracy. It's always tied to supposed egalitarianism and the idea that you can socially condition man through J.B. Watson and Pavlovian type conditioning. So
sure.
Are you familiar with like the idea of I'm sure you are, but maybe you could flesh out from your perspective the idea of how it might be linked to operant conditioning.
I think it's through and through. It's subtle and it's consistent throughout the entire 15,000 hour experience. And the Skinnerian behaviorists definitely were very, very influential. And there was, this went through a couple of different phases, and I'm a little unclear on dates, but I know there was a series of papers that were written. I actually have a video about it. It's called The Scientific Management of America, and it's based on it's just me reading from the underground history of American education by John Taylor Gatto, but it's enhanced with some footage. And Gatto mentions three papers that, of course, nobody knows about, but were all basically behaviorist applications to the schools in the 1960s. So once the schools were, up and running, they can be refit or modified for, the changing needs of social engineering. And that's where I see, I mean, obviously, yes, behaviorism goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, but the collision between the public schools in America, it seems to happen in the 1950s and the 1960s. And I think it's, it's further. Are you familiar with Peg Luxick? Does that name ring a bell?
I'm not.
Peg, it's this, straight from VHS to YouTube video that you can find of this woman named Peg Luxick, who was on a school board in Pennsylvania, talking about the federal role of education. This was probably in the early 1990s. The title of the video is "Who Controls Our Children?" And She talks about this idea of remediation. This is often referred to as outcomes-based education. You heard that term?
Yeah.
So there was a big dust-up in the South, like maybe 5 years ago, where the news story was conservatives were mad because they wanted something called critical thinking taken out of the Texas curriculum. So, everyone in the media goes, ha, 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 conservatives, aren't they cute? And what they were really protesting was critical thinking being used as a cover term for this outcomes-based education, which was really about remediation. Education is not about knowledge outcomes. It's about thought outcomes, orientation outcomes, how
Praxis.
you feel.
It's about producing a product, the cubicle worker.
Yeah, well, it's that. So there's a kind of subordination that and that goal of school goes back at least to the industrial age, but also it's about producing certain types of attitudes. And if you don't get those attitudes through standardized tests, and this is part of what Peg Luxick is warning people in the school district about in this video, the standardized test as a scientific tool to check to see if certain attitudes have been inculcated in students, right? So people think that these are, aptitude tests, but they're really attitude tests. Is the school conditioning children with the right attitudes and, larger orientation to the world that is preferable to scientific managers? And that it always gets more sophisticated, but that's always the story in one form or another, back to the beginning.
Yes, there's the program in the UK or Scotland actually called GERFEC. Are you familiar with that?
No, I've never heard of that.
That's interesting because this is the socialist program there to assign, I'm not joking by the way, to assign a social worker for you your whole life. I don't know how exactly the numbers are supposed to match out. I guess maybe one social worker per 10 or 20 people, maybe something like this, but it's the most insane thing you've ever heard, the most, like Soviet Empire on acid type thing, where it's like
right.
Everything that you do throughout your life, you're going to be subject to a social worker. And this begins, from your earliest days, I guess prior to kindergarten. I don't know, but I noticed when I was in California last summer that some of the places in some of the cities in California, which is of course always the revolutionary ground for the rest of the country, the stuff that happens there filters out towards the middle. They're in New York, towards the middle of the country. A couple decades later, I noticed that they were setting up. I'm not positive whether they were state funded or not, but they were like educational outlets pre-kindergarten. I don't remember what the word they used was, but it was like pre-kindergarten, kindergarten or something.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So
absolutely.
They're moving to even get it. Like daycare is transitioning into some kind of like pre-kindergarten thing, and your child then of course spends basically their entire life in some other person's responsibility with them, brainwashing them. So what I'm getting at is just that I think that you start to see that these are sort of global patterns where they're really trying to push these things, not just in the U.S. but across the board in other countries even.
Well, it's interesting, yeah, especially in some of these
learning, you see, because that's what the GERFEC program is going to be. Is that you don't reach a point where you're done with this gigantic monstrosity of the Leviathan of the state. You are supposed to stay within the system your entire life.
Well, yeah, I think, and the sooner you can start, the better. And as you look at the broader picture of that, especially in these more socialist countries, like how useful it is to get kids into the schools sooner, because then mom can go to work, and because what do you need a family for? The state's going to take care of that. So you see that these pieces kind of work together in that way. This has been pretty controversial, but out here where I am in New England, like the whole pre-K thing is, it's pretty standard. It's not public in a lot of places, but the reality is that parents go to work, And one parent can't stay home to raise a child in those early and very formative years. So they either go to some kind of daycare or some kind of pre-K program. And yeah, I think these people, again, especially in the more socialist countries or the more collectivistic societies, would say, that's great. We just get the children sooner, and that should be a public system. And they probably are. I mean, in a lot of the Scandinavian countries that American progressives are always, so excited about, those are government funded projects. So, get kids away from the family, and that promotes egalitarianism, because families, a family could be anything, and somebody could start life 20 steps ahead, and that's not fair. So let's just standardize everybody, homogenize everybody through state schools.
So let's get into more of the educational methodology. This is what you know about. This is I would assume your area of expertise, so to speak.
Sure.
What has been the major alteration? So, if we think back to, the basic fields that everybody studies of reading, writing, arithmetic, and, you had your grammar, and I don't guess anybody learns logic anymore until you get to unless you're studying philosophy at a undergraduate level, you're probably not taking logic. What was can you point to the shifts? What were the big changes? And are the whispers and stories that we hear about Obamacare, or Common Core, are they that bad?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to start with the last part of that question, the Common Core is probably the most blatant. The managerial class or corporations have been able to, at least since the foundation of the U.S. Federal Department of Education in the late 70s and its growth throughout the 1980s, they've been able to order up, what they need the schools to produce. Mm-hmm. And, they're more than happy to have taxpayers pay for the training of a labor force. So it became very apparent in this last phase, and this kind of goes from, again, Goals 2000 to No Child Left Behind to Common Core.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure where it will go next, but in the Common Core phase, it was very clear, because people were sending me screenshots of or pictures like, here's my kid's homework, here's how my kid is learning math. And it is preparing students to basically work in a service economy, to be almost completely intellectually helpless, and there's great that with that lack of critical thinking. It's also, there's great advantages as far as a kind of cultural conditioning that most people will accept fairly passively, and I think we've probably seen that become more apparent just in the last 10 or even maybe just in the last 5 years. The establishment of the Federal Department of Education was a big step in that direction for basically allowing outside interests to shape the output of the schools. But I'm trying to trace back through the 20th century, mm-hmm. because if you do look at materials that public school students were given in, say, the 1890s,
right.
Most of it is work that college students could not do today. And I am sorry, I'm kind of pausing here as I'm trying to map that progression a little bit better. But it's tough, because obviously the schools were, a branch of industry originally. So you don't think that they would want to be producing highly creative and curious critical thinkers. The setup for the schools was to produce industrial workers. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting that in a pre-knowledge economy, right? We're talking about an industrial economy. People were learning at a much higher level and being challenged in ways at a middle school age that they're not challenged at a college age today. So that I'm struggling with that timeline a little bit as I think about it. I mean, there certainly are de-evolutionary steps along the way that get us up to today, mm-hmm. but it didn't really start, trying to produce. It's a couple of quotes come to mind in Wilson's age. So we're going back to the 1910s. We want one class of people to have a liberal education. and we want another class. I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but he said we want another class, a very much larger class of necessity to fit themselves to perform specific, difficult manual tasks. And there's echoes in that of a Rockefeller Education Board quote or statement from about 20 years earlier, where the gist of the statement is basically, look, we have enough philosophers and poets and scientists. Like that's a small fraction of the workforce. And those people, those rare people, those special people, they'll always exist. And us in the upper classes or those who look down at everybody else, we'll always be producing more of them. That lineage will continue. So those things will always be staffed. We've got this other problem where we have millions of nitwits that we need control. And at the end of that quote was, we want to teach children to do certain simple things in a perfect way that their parents are currently doing in an imperfect way. So from the beginning, it's you don't have, if you tested like or graphed educational competency from the output of the schools, you don't have like a sharp drop off or even like a noticeable decline over time. Like it's bad from the beginning.
Yeah. It
was conceived as a branch of industry and a tool of governance. And, neither of those goals suggests that you're going to be producing, free-minded, entrepreneurial types of thinkers.
Yeah, and I think that there's consistent documentation of that when you come even a few decades further from the period that you're talking about, when you get into the 50s. And as I mentioned, you have the Reese Committee looking into the influence of the tax-exempt foundations, and you have the Dodd report. And the discussion, the discussion states that the Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie endowments were funding Columbia, Harvard, Chicago, University of California, et cetera, explicitly, quote, to promote oligarchical collectivism. So what's interesting, the reason I bring that up is that that's the same methodology and ideology of decades earlier, the people in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900, 1910, the Deweys, the Manns, the Bodes, the Bernards, the Carters, not Jimmy Carter, who were all saying the same thing: socialistic collectivism, democratic collectivism, right? And by the 50s, the committee is like, hey, wait a minute, all this collectivism is being funded by these oligarchic billionaire families. Something is off here.
And the move was always towards more globalism. I remember one of the findings from the Reese Committee was something like, we want to make sure that people in America, these nationalistic, not that I'm a huge fan of nationalism, but these individualistic and nationalistic people are never able to return to their pre-World War I mentality. We can't go back to that. We now have to have this, global vision, and they all have to basically absorb that global vision as well. So this is, most of my talk about the Reese Committee actually probably came in shows that had some kind of British angle, because that sort of the reunification project was a big part of that story as well. But yeah, it affected the schools. It affected, again, back to the attitudes that were being shaped in the schools, not just towards. It's a shame. It's like it's interesting. We. Sorry to tangent here for a minute, but we don't spend a lot of time on my show talking about school anymore. I did in the beginning. But today, we really talk about education.
Now it's all fart jokes and toilet flushing.
Right.
Now it's all Bane impersonations into a cup.
One day we'll just have to do a show. I'd like to do this with you of just all voices. I think that would be terrific.
Gulp down all of this water so that I could rip off your Bane cup impersonation that you do. If you haven't seen Brett do it, it's funny. You have to subscribe, I guess, to Tragedy and Hope, and you see the secret Tragedy and Hope videos, and Brett gets the cup out, and he talks into the cup just like Bane.
Oh, there's a YouTube School Sucks podcast is my YouTube channel, and there's a video of it's called Trump rips off his inauguration speech from Bain,
okay.
but where did Bain get it? It's just a quick a 2-minute video people can find if they want to see that for free. But yeah, so in the beginning it was all schools this, school that. But eventually, I wanted the show to be constructive. So I said, well, enough talking about school, right? And this is one of the most important parts of the School Sucks project is making the distinction between school and education. School is social engineering. It's overseen by strangers to produce kind of social efficiency in a dependable order for whoever happens to be in power and whoever happens to be able to use it. Education is self-directed. Hopefully, it's lifelong. It's a pursuit of knowledge and understanding and wisdom, and those are very different things. And I feel like a lot of times when we're critical of the public school, we get sucked into this. And I think this is useful for maybe people in your audience who might want to share information about the problems with the schools. We get sucked into this how would kids be educated kind of conversation, which is like, well, they're not being educated now.
Right.
So it's like, if somebody had a plate in front of them with a stack of Wonder Bread and a mound of sugar, and I took it away from them, and they said, well, how will I be nourished? It's the same kind of idea.
Right.
So,
well, you mean there's fluoride in the public drinking water? How would we drink water? It's really stupid, yeah.
So the point that I'm trying to make is, and I also know that you've been critical of the libertarian philosophy as well. And I mean, I see myself as a libertarian, but I don't see that as like a society-wide project. I see that as an individual project. I'm trying to live as free as I can in an unfree world, and that freedom breaks out because freedom is a very kind of nebulous word.
Right.
It breaks out to mean different things across a variety of different categories. I mean, obviously, the general idea is that you're free of coercion, that you're making your own decisions, that you're following your volition. But what is freedom in health? What is freedom in thought? What is freedom in education? What is freedom in vocation? And I think that that's something that has to be built from the individual up. And I think this is a pretty significant distinction between just sort of general political right and left as they're applied in the United States. The right, and I know this is also true of a lot of like the religious right.
Uh-huh.
There's an effort to perfect the individual, right? That starts with the individual.
Sure.
Well, on the left, it's an effort to perfect society.
Yeah.
And the individual is often, unfortunately, a casualty of that, right? So I didn't realize how stuck in this mindset I was just because of an apathetic, public school graduate mind that I was in my early 20s, or when I found libertarianism in my, late 20s. I have this show that's supposed to be about the wonders of pursuing education, and I name it School Sucks, which evidences that I'm kind of stuck in that left-wing mindset. I'm going after something that's institutional and inaccessible, something that minimizes my own power by focusing on this thing that I'm probably never going to be able to do anything about in my life, instead of saying, the individual pursuit of education is a wonderful thing. It's not as good of a name for a show, but that's the idea. I mean, that's really what we're trying to present here. So, I want to come at it from that way, but the approach of the scientific managers has always been from the top down. The idea of perfecting the individual from the bottom up, that's always been a kind of liability.
Well, on that note, what do you think about scientism? Because one of the reasons that I kind of go the route I do and why I'm critical of libertarianism is because it's often connected with the notion of, in the realm of philosophy, what we term atomism. And so the atomistic individual, right, who's conceived of as a unit, whether a unit of commodity or a unit of government tabulation, we would say doesn't really matter, because the root problem is atomism. That is that the individual can conceive of a worldview or of his meaning or who he is as an individual. And I think that's the the key criticism that I would make, or what I'm trying to get across when I debate someone on that topic or disagree with them is not that what you're saying about the existing system is wrong, because I think it's always almost 99% of the time correct. What you're saying about government, what you're saying about socialism, what you're saying about this, that, and the other, taxation. So, for example, in monarchies, traditionally, like a monarchy would have less taxation than we have in our supposed democratic republic. Now, I'm not saying that proves monarchy. I'm just saying, how could that even be the case, given the absurdity of our present system?
Sure.
So you might want to say, well, yeah, but I think that if we had no government, it would be better. We don't have to go into a debate on the state or anything like that, but my question is even more fundamental in that regard. It's just simply, when we speak of freedom and liberty, which I'm a big fan of, and that's why I find a lot of common ground with libertarians, is because the critical approach that you're taking, what you're saying is wrong, again, I agree with. But I just don't think that there's such a thing as liberty or freedom that exists outside of a philosophy that is, in some sense, a tradition that gives meaning to what a person is. So liberty or freedom, I think, has to presuppose the notion of personhood, that there's some self that has some sort of dignity or worth, or that is the unit that you're talking about, that is able to choose and make decisions, right? So, for example, if I was a libertarian and, say, a materialist, and I believe that, like, maybe I got into libertarianism, but I was a big fan of, like, Dawkins or Lawrence Krauss or Hitchens or one of these characters, I don't see how one could really talk about the freedom of the individual or the individual having any worth whatsoever, given the fact that I'm also adhering to, like, materialism as a reductionist scientism type position. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, okay, so maybe I'm misunderstanding. I mean, first of all, like, just to go back to something you said earlier, if anyone is arguing that they can build some conception of self or meaning of the, personal meaning in the world in a vacuum, I would completely disagree with that. Obviously, I'm influenced by the family that I came from and the culture that I grew up in. And, I think initially when people, or for me anyway, I guess I can only speak for myself, when this philosophy was new, especially for me, transferring to libertarianism from this sort of hyper skeptical left, it was very easy to turn my nose up at everything. It's kind of like these are two political belief systems that come packaged with, if you want to wield them as weapons, a kind of moral superiority. The left especially, but libertarianism, you can see a lot of this there too. So you kind of reject all of these things. You're skeptical of culture. I started to get creeped out by how the more I learned about postmodernism, the more of Marx I would see in some of this stuff, and I really had to wrestle with that. And I think that's an ongoing struggle for a lot of people, is understanding myself in a larger context. Now, to the other part of that, I might just need you to repeat the second part, Jay. I was forming.
Well, what I was saying was that this point that, for example, Quigley makes the argument early on in Tragedy and Hope, say the first 100 or 200 pages, he talks about what I call banker strategy beta, and this is the funding of revolutionary movements and the gold standard back, in the 1700s. So when we think about scientific revolution and we think about French Revolution and its counterpart, the American Revolution, even according to someone like Quigley, he admits that those were shifts at the behest of the money power out of the older notions of what made up a society. So you had, prior to that, monarchies, and then you have this shift into the supposed righteousness of the democratic republic, and that's what begins to spread. You have all these revolutions throughout that period. You have the French Revolution, Napoleonic Revolution, and most of the countries in the world experience these revolutions. And the point of that is just to say that my view is that both the more right-wing revolution of what are called Girondins, and this would be like a Jeffersonian type thought, who believed in private property and things like this, or a left-wing revolution, which would be the Jacobins. These would be more communist or Adam Weishaupt type, radical Marxists. These are two branches of the revolution from that time period on, and even Quigley says this, as well as many other historians who will talk about the French Revolution. And so what I'm getting at is just that I don't see how the libertarian, this is just my criticism of libertarianism. I wasn't planning to get into this, but you brought it up. So
yeah, sure.
The libertarian ideology, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, all this kind of stuff comes out of that right-wing revolution from this period. And it's all part of the same dog and pony show, in my view, insofar as, on the one hand, you're forced to choose between like individualism or collectivism. Now that does not mean I'm saying that everything that the libertarian says is wrong, or that I agree with a lot of what the Marxists say. I'm not interested in Marxism at all. I think it's terrible. But I'm also not interested in atomistic individualism, and that is what is sort of the presupposition of the libertarian ethos. Whether you look at Ayn Rand or whether you go back to Adam Smith or whoever you're looking at in these characters, you have the idea that, is it going to be the Übermensch of the individual, or is it going to be the new man of the collective Borg? Right.
Right.
Like, is it going to be Are we going to listen to Che Guevara, or are we going to listen to Ayn Rand?
Okay, yeah, that's interesting, because I would be very critical of Ayn Rand as somebody who is creating these very sort of, flat protagonists to be these sort of embodiments of her philosophy, which I think has a lot of noble ideas in it, especially as a response to maybe being exposed to the Russian Revolution, and that sort of Marxism on steroids. And maybe Rand's approach was a little. I value her work very much, but I think maybe considering where she came from, what she saw, the sort of Dagny Taggarts that she creates are an overcorrection. Excited response.
Well, I was just using her as an example, but I mean, you just
sure.
pick somebody from von Mises Institute, or pick whoever, Ron Paul, whoever the hero libertarian is. I guess I just don't see how it's not still part of the maybe not as bad of a dialectic of American modern left-right GOP stuff, but in my view, it's just a dialectic that's like 100 years older or 200 years older. We go back to the French Revolution, and the whole notion of right and left, communist versus individual, comes out of that French revolutionary model. That they would meet at it was called the Vendier. It was this old tennis ball court, and the Girondins sat on the right side, and I think this was like Lafayette and the sort of noble characters who wanted to retain private property and wanted individual rights. And then on the left side of the tennis court, you had this is the provisional government they were setting up. You had the Jacobins. And so this is where we actually get the terms left and right in politics. And according to Quigley, this was bankers. It was Swiss and Jewish bankers that funded the French Revolution. Now, I'm not saying that everybody involved in the revolution was consciously aware of what they were doing, but rather that these revolutionary forces tend to be, again, just tools of the bigger powers, as Bolshevism was funded out of London and New York. So I just don't believe, for example, that you can divorce ideologies from history, or that you can divorce something like even logic from tradition. Because if you're going to say you're going to study symbolic logic, it's really not possible to do that apart from understanding Aristotle and the Western and Greek tradition. Does that mean that I'm saying it's culturally relative? No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that the only way that we get access to this is still within the bounds of some, quote, tradition.
No, absolutely, and I think that was the impulse to dismiss that thoroughly, which is an idea that's it did start to make me very suspicious, right? Like how did this impulse get so wrapped up in something that in many ways should respect certain traditions of the West, philosophic, economic, political, and want to improve upon them. It's interesting, though. You brought up something. You did raise a question. Do you see this dialectic or this libertarian movement as something that's capable of being, I don't know, weaponized by oligarchs the same way other revolutionary movements were?
Yes.
Okay. Because I'm wondering, I'm actually even, like, just in the last 5 days with this whole Syria Trump thing, I'm wondering, like, did that just happen? Right? Because they sucked in a lot of people from the libertarian movement to support of Trump to basically just, throw all their weight and emotion and energy behind what, I mean, it's too early to tell, but what easily could become, the next neocon puppet, basically.
Right. And I think that he is already moving in that direction. And I was starting to note little bits of caving in here and there. When I wrote an article, I was calling him the postmodern president, or in league with that Federalist article. That's the reason I was supporting it, is not because I think that the American government is necessarily, quote, legitimate, or I mean, it's really just a matter of power and force. It's a very will to power type situation. It's legitimacy and quote unquote in the state is a very complex, different topic. But I just thought, look, it's so bad. Maybe this wacky, goofy character will do some good. And so, yeah, I did provisionally support Trump. And then I always said, of course, all along the last several months that, anytime he does something I disagree with, it's not like my show has any influence anyway. It's not like I'm going to change policy, so it's not that big of a deal. But I said I would obviously disagree with him. I don't care anything about neoconservatism. I think it's ridiculous. But sure. Yes, neoconservatism is just dressed up Trotskyism and Bolshevism, and that's a flavor of revolutionary thought. And in the same way, if you look at the history of for example, the Libertarian Party, I'm not accusing you of this or trying to implicate you. I don't know what your affiliations are politically, but just through my own research of the Libertarian Party, I think it's suspicious that you have a lot of these CIA characters that are a part of it. That is circumstantial evidence. It doesn't prove anything per se, but I think that anytime you get all these, quote, former CIA people involved in the party and running it and being their presidential nominee and all this kind of stuff, I'm already suspicious of it. When you look at David Rockefeller writing his master's thesis on von Hayek, and he was actually a big proponent of that Austrian school of economics for a long time. I don't know if he grew out of that and grew into his monopoly oligarchic view, or if he believed his monopoly oligarchic view the whole time. I just see it as a situation where I don't really see why one wouldn't adopt a David Rockefeller worldview if you were a libertarian. I mean, why not? In other words, like you were criticizing Ayn Rand, why not? If you're John Galt, like, what would keep you from actively involving in buying off the state? I mean, there's nothing morally. You can talk about morals, but who gives a shit? like why would I be bound by this principle of, it's immoral if I'm John Galt, to buy off the state and have the state enforce laws that give my company a monopoly? Like, why wouldn't you do that? You've been listening to the first half of my interview with Brett Veinotte of the School Sucks podcast. If you want to hear the full talk, go ahead and go to jaysanalysis.com and subscribe for $4.95 a month for $60 a year. You can also purchase my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, the bestseller with 60 5-star reviews across markets. Also, check out the School Sucks Project, which is Brett's work. You can find all kinds of information there. And thank you for listening. You're listening to Jay's Analysis. This is the introduction to the Jay's Analysis podcast. The only authoritative source for Jay's Analysis is Jay's Analysis. Film, philosophy, geopolitics, the esoteric, and much, much more. Satire and comedy too, now added bonus for free.